The deck of the Akagi trembled with organized chaos. June 4, 1942, 0900 hours, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Aviation ordnancemen sprinted across the flight deck, wrestling 800-kilogram bombs on wheeled carts, desperately trying to swap them for torpedoes on aircraft that had just been rearmed minutes before. Fuel lines snaked across the teak planking. Ammunition belts lay coiled beside Type 99 carrier bombers. Loose ordnance sat stacked near the elevators, waiting to be struck below to the magazines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, Air Operations Officer aboard the Akagi and the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, stood on the bridge watching the controlled pandemonium below. He checked his watch again. The rearming operation that should have taken an hour was being compressed into minutes because radar reports and scout plane sightings had just confirmed what Japanese commanders hoped wouldn't happen. American carriers were out there, somewhere to the northeast, and they were launching strikes. But Fuchida wasn't worried. Not yet. The Kido Butai, Japan's elite carrier strike force, had survived worse. They had executed the impossible at Pearl Harbor, demolished British forces in the Indian Ocean, and ruled the Pacific for 6 months without a single strategic defeat. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with over 250 aircraft and the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. They had encountered American carrier forces before at the Coral Sea a month earlier, and while the tactical results had been mixed, they had maintained the initiative. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai from Akagi's flag bridge, faced an impossible tactical equation that morning. His first strike against Midway Island had departed at 0430 hours, 108 aircraft tasked with neutralizing American air power on the island itself. The strike had achieved tactical surprise, but the air group commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, had radioed back a message that changed everything. A second strike on Midway was necessary. American forces on the island remained combat capable. Nagumo had held back 93 aircraft, a second wave armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically for engaging ships. This was standard doctrine. Maintain a reserve strike force configured for the carrier battle that might develop. But Tomonaga's message created a dilemma. If American carriers were present, he needed those 93 aircraft armed for ship attack. If no American carriers were nearby, he needed them rearmed with land attack ordnance for the second Midway strike. At 0715 hours, Nagumo made his decision. No American carriers, and had been conclusively spotted. The Midway strike force was returning, low on fuel, and would need to land immediately. He ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed for a second Midway attack, switching torpedoes for bombs, armor-piercing munitions for high explosives. It was a logical decision based on available intelligence, and it was about to prove catastrophic. 20 minutes later, at 0728 hours, reconnaissance floatplane pilot Tone No. 4 transmitted a message that sent shockwaves through the flag bridge. Enemy ships sighted 10 ships, including what appears to be one carrier, bearing 010 degrees, 240 miles from Midway. The American carriers weren't a distant possibility anymore. They were present, they were close, and based on standard doctrine, they were almost certainly launching strikes. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming operation reversed. Strike aircraft that had just been reconfigured for land attack needed to be reconfigured, again for ship attack. Torpedoes replaced bombs. High explosives gave way to armor-piercing munitions. It was a nightmare of wasted time and accumulated vulnerability. Every minute spent rearming on deck was a minute the carriers couldn't launch or recover aircraft, couldn't maneuver freely, and sat increasingly exposed to the American strike that was almost certainly inbound. The Japanese confidence that morning wasn't arrogance. It was based on 6 months of unbroken success and a doctrine that had proven devastatingly effective. The Kido Butai's operational philosophy emphasized concentration of force, aggressive action, and overwhelming the enemy through coordinated multi-carrier strikes. At Pearl Harbor, they had demonstrated what this doctrine could achieve. 6 carriers launching over 350 aircraft in 2 waves, achieving complete tactical surprise and destroying or crippling 8 American battleships in less than 2 hours. The aftermath of Pearl Harbor had created a psychological transformation within the Imperial Japanese Navy. Officers who had spent careers training for a decisive battleship engagement now understood that carriers were the new capital ships, that aviation was the new gunnery, and that whoever struck first with the most aircraft would control the battle. They had refined this doctrine through combat operations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In April 1942, the Kido Butai had raided Ceylon, sinking the British carrier Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers, while decimating British air power in the region. Japanese carrier pilots were the most experienced in the world by mid-1942. Men like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, leader of the Pearl Harbor fighter escort, had over 1,500 flight hours and years of combat experience in China. The average Japanese carrier pilot had over 800 flight hours, compared to American pilots with 200 to 300 hours. They had trained for years in demanding conditions that emphasized precision, discipline, and the ability to execute complex coordinated attacks. The carriers themselves represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. Akagi, the flagship, displaced 36,000 tons fully loaded and could make 31 knots, fast enough to outrun most enemy surface ships. Her flight deck measured 855 feet, allowing simultaneous launch and recovery operations that American carriers of the period couldn't match. Below decks, she carried 91 aircraft, aviation fuel, ordnance, and the complex machinery necessary to maintain air operations at sea. But the design philosophy that made Japanese carriers so effective also created vulnerabilities that weren't apparent until tested in combat. American carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown used armored flight decks and extensive compartmentalization that isolated damage. Japanese carriers prioritized aircraft capacity and operational tempo over survivability. Their flight decks were wooden teak over steel framework, not armored. Aviation fuel lines ran throughout the ship with minimal redundancy. Damage control systems existed, but weren't as robust as American equivalents. Most critically, Japanese doctrine emphasized keeping maximum aircraft on deck, ready for immediate launch. This maximized strike capability but also concentrated aviation fuel, ordnance, and aircraft in the most vulnerable location possible. American doctrine preferred keeping aircraft in armored hangars until needed, accepting slower launch times in exchange for reduced vulnerability. The Japanese gambled that their superior pilots and coordinated tactics would let them strike first, and first strike would decide the battle. That gamble had worked perfectly for 6 months. At Midway, it was about to fail catastrophically. The morning of June 4th began with the Kido Butai executing a complex aerial ballet. The first Midway strike launched at 0430 108 aircraft rising into the pre-dawn darkness. The reserve strike force sat armed and ready on deck, 93 aircraft configured for ship attack, combat air patrol fighters orbited overhead, scout planes fanned out across search sectors, looking for American forces. Everything proceeded according to plan until Tomonaga's message requested a second Midway strike. Then Nagumo's decision to rearm for land attack. Then the scout plane report of American carriers. Then the order to rearm again. By 0800 hours, the Akagi's flight deck embodied every vulnerability inherent in Japanese doctrine. Aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip, some armed with bombs, some with torpedoes, some half rearmed. Fuel lines lay exposed across the deck, feeding aircraft whose engines were being warmed for launch. Loose ordnance sat stacked near the island superstructure and elevator openings, bombs and torpedoes removed from aircraft, but not yet struck below to the magazines because the rearming operation was proceeding too quickly for normal safety procedures. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Kido Butai's defensive posture that morning was theoretically sound. Combat air patrol fighters orbited at multiple altitudes, ready to intercept inbound strikes. The carriers maneuvered in a box formation that allowed mutual anti-aircraft support while maintaining freedom of movement. Screening destroyers and cruisers with their own anti-aircraft batteries surrounded the formation. Against a conventional attack, properly coordinated by experienced pilots executing a well-planned strike, this defense would have been formidable. But what approached from the northeast wasn't a coordinated strike. It was a desperate improvisation by American pilots who had gotten lost, separated from their escorts, and were running low on fuel. Between 0700 and 0930 hours, American torpedo bomber squadrons from Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet found the Japanese fleet and attacked piecemeal, without fighter escort, flying obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator aircraft that were slow, poorly armed, and catastrophically vulnerable. The result was a massacre. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, attacked first at approximately 0800 hours. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Not one torpedo hit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 14 aircraft launched, 10 were shot down, no hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed. 12 aircraft attacked, 10 were destroyed, no hits. In less than 90 minutes, 41 American torpedo bombers were shot down, with only 6 surviving aircraft and minimal damage inflicted on Japanese carriers. Japanese pilots considered the engagement a stunning victory. American torpedo attacks had been brave but suicidal, poorly coordinated, and executed by aircraft that couldn't survive in the modern combat environment. The combat, air patrol had performed exactly as doctrine dictated, intercepting low-altitude threats and destroying them before they could reach the carriers. Zero fighters slashed through the torpedo bomber formations, their 20mm cannon and twin 7.7mm machine guns shredding the lightly armored American aircraft. What the Japanese pilots didn't realize was that the torpedo bomber attacks, while tactically futile, had achieved something critically important. They had drawn the combat air patrol down to sea level. Every Zero fighter was either low on altitude, engaged with torpedo bombers, or had exhausted ammunition and fuel. The sky above the Kido Butai, that crucial defensive zone between 10,000 and 20,000 feet where dive bombers operated, was empty. At 0920 hours, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise, made a navigational decision that would change history. His squadrons had launched at 0700 hours, tasked with striking the last known position of the Japanese fleet. When they arrived at the anticipated interception point, they found empty ocean. The Japanese had maneuvered during the delay caused by rearming operations, and McCluskey's squadrons were now hunting across hundreds of square miles of Pacific Ocean, with fuel running dangerously low. Standard procedure would have been to return to Enterprise, accept mission failure, and preserve aircraft and pilots for future operations. McCluskey made a different choice. He gambled on tactical intuition, turning his squadrons northeast based on his assessment of likely Japanese movements. At 0920 hours, his dive bomber crews spotted a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing northeast at maximum speed, leaving a distinctive wake visible from high altitude. The destroyer had been attacking the American submarine Nautilus and was now rejoining the main formation. McCluskey followed that wake, like a highway drawn across the ocean. At approximately 0925 hours, his pilots saw them, 4 Japanese carriers, maneuvering in formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. The scene from 15,000 feet looked almost surreal in its vulnerability. Every aircraft sat on deck in various states of rearming. The combat air patrol was at sea level, consumed with the torpedo bomber attacks that were still ongoing from Yorktown's squadron. Anti-aircraft fire was minimal because gun crews were tracking low-altitude threats, not high-altitude dive bombers. McCluskey didn't hesitate. He signaled attack, and 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise rolled into their attack runs. Almost simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bomber squadron from Yorktown, which had also gotten lost and was also running critically low on fuel, arrived at the same location from a slightly different vector. 17 more dive bombers added to the inbound strike. The Japanese had 4 minutes. From the moment American dive bombers were first spotted by lookouts at approximately 09:22 hours until the first bombs struck at 09:26 hours, 4 minutes to sound alarms, then vector fighters, bring gun crews to bear, and implement damage control procedures. 4 minutes to prepare for the most devastating 4 minutes in Japanese naval history. Lookouts aboard Akagi screamed warnings. Crew members pointed skyward at the distinctive silhouettes of SBD Dauntlesses, beginning their dives, black specks against blue sky that suddenly grew larger as gravity and throttle acceleration pushed them toward terminal velocity. Air raid sirens wailed across all 4 carriers. Commanders shouted orders that couldn't possibly be executed in time. Gun crews trained weapons skyward, but engaging a diving bomber required lead time to calculate trajectories, and there was no time. The carriers attempted evasive maneuvers, but ships displacing 30 to 40,000 tons don't respond instantly to helm orders. A carrier traveling at 30 knots requires over 2 minutes just to initiate a 90-degree turn. The helmsmen threw their wheels over, engines thrashed water into foam, but the massive ships were still moving essentially on their original headings when the dive bombers reached release altitude. Akagi's captain, Taijiro Aoki, watched helplessly as 3 SBD Dauntlesses completed their dives and released their bombs. The first bomb missed, impacting the water 50 feet off the starboard side. The second bomb struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating through to the upper hangar before exploding among aircraft being serviced. The third bomb hit near the aft elevator, its blast effect catching a Type 99 bomber that had just been fueled and armed. The Type 99 exploded, its bomb detonated, fuel ignited. The resulting fireball consumed everything within a 50-foot radius: aircraft, ordnance, fuel lines, and deck crew. Secondary explosions rippled outward as stacked bombs and torpedoes began cooking off from the heat. Aviation fuel, stored in various locations because of the rushed rearming, ignited in multiple places simultaneously. Within seconds, Akagi's flight deck transformed from a functioning aircraft carrier to an inferno. Kaga, sailing in formation 2 miles from Akagi, faced the same nightmare. 4 bombs struck her flight deck in rapid succession. The first 2 penetrated to the hangar, exploding among tightly packed aircraft. The third hit detonated an ammunition magazine. The fourth struck near the bridge, killing most of the senior officers instantaneously. The explosions touched off a chain reaction identical to Akagi's experience. Fuel ignited, ordnance exploded, and within minutes the carrier was burning out of control from stem to stern. Soryu, the third carrier to be struck, took 3 bombs in less than 60 seconds. All 3 penetrated the flight deck before exploding. 1 bomb exploded in the hangar among refueling aircraft. Another detonated near the forward aviation fuel storage. The third hit near the bomb magazine. The combination of fuel fires and exploding ordnance created a self-sustaining conflagration that overwhelmed damage control efforts almost immediately. In approximately 5 minutes, from 09:26 to 09:31 hours, 3 Japanese fleet carriers had been transformed from combat-effective strike platforms into burning hulks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, sailing several miles separated from the main formation, remained untouched by the initial strike and would survive until afternoon when a second American strike would find and fatally damage her as well. The catastrophe wasn't just about bombs hitting targets. American pilots in later years would emphasize that their success resulted from finding Japanese carriers at precisely the worst possible moment. If the attack had come 30 minutes earlier, the carriers would have had most ordnance struck below in magazines, fuel lines would have been cleared, and aircraft would have been properly secured. If the attack had come 30 minutes later, the Japanese strike force would have launched, the decks would have been clear, and the carriers would have been maneuvering freely without the constraints of rearming operations. Instead, the American dive bombers arrived at the one moment when Japanese carriers were simultaneously most vulnerable and least able to defend themselves. Every advantage Japanese doctrine emphasized, aggressive action, concentrated force, maximum aircraft on deck, had been transformed into fatal vulnerabilities. The decision to rearm twice in rapid succession, forced by changing tactical situation, but also by doctrine that demanded immediate offensive action, had left the carriers exposed exactly when American dive bombers broke through cloud cover overhead. Commander Minoru Genda, Air Operations Officer for the Kido Butai and one of the principal planners of the Pearl Harbor attack, stood on Akagi's flag bridge, watching his operational concept consumed by fire. The doctrine that had worked so perfectly for 6 months, the emphasis on offensive power over defensive strength, the concentration of aircraft on deck for rapid launch, the prioritization of speed over armor, every decision that had seemed brilliant on December 7th was now revealed as catastrophic miscalculation on June 4th. The human cost became immediately apparent. Aviation ordnancemen who had been struggling to rearm aircraft were caught on deck when the bombs struck. Many died instantly from blast effects. Others, trapped by spreading fires, faced impossible choices. Some jumped overboard into the Pacific. Others tried to fight their way below decks through passages already filling with smoke and heat. Medical parties attempting to reach the wounded found compartments sealed by damage control measures, watertight doors that couldn't be opened without flooding additional sections. Below decks, damage control parties faced an impossible situation. Japanese carrier design emphasized offensive capability over survivability, meaning damage control systems were minimal compared to American equivalents. Fire mains ruptured from blast damage, leaving crews without water pressure to fight the spreading fires. Compartmentalization wasn't as extensive as American designs, allowing fire and smoke to spread through multiple decks. Aviation fuel, stored in multiple locations because of operational tempo, created numerous independent fire sources that overwhelmed available firefighting capability. Akagi's crew fought for hours to save their ship. They flooded magazines to prevent catastrophic explosions. They attempted to isolate burning sections by sealing bulkheads. They evacuated wounded to the stern, where medical personnel established aid stations on the fantail. But the fires continued spreading, fed by aviation fuel that seemed inexhaustible, creeping through ventilation systems and cable runs into sections previously thought secure. By noon, 12 hours after the first Midway strike had launched in pre-dawn darkness, Akagi was dead in the water, her flight deck and hangar spaces completely consumed by fire, her engineering spaces flooded to control fires that threatened munitions magazines. Vice Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, watching from her bridge as the carrier that had been his flagship burned. Kaga's fate was even more rapid. The 4 bomb hits that struck her flight deck at 09:26 hours created immediate catastrophic damage. 1 bomb penetrated to the lower hangar and detonated near the aviation fuel storage, creating a fireball that swept through multiple compartments. Another hit detonated ammunition stores, the blast effect rupturing the side of the ship and allowing flooding that complicated damage control efforts. By 10:00 hours, just 34 minutes after being struck, Captain Jisaku Okada ordered abandon ship. The fires were beyond control, magazines were cooking off, and the ship was listing heavily. Kaga remained afloat for nearly 8 more hours, burning from end to end, her hull glowing red from internal fires. She finally sank at 19:25 hours, taking 814 crew members with her. Soryu's end came even faster. The 3 bombs that struck her at approximately 09:27 hours all hit critical areas. Damage control efforts collapsed within 20 minutes as fires spread out of control. By 10:45 hours, just 78 minutes after being struck, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto ordered his crew to abandon ship, though he chose to go down with his vessel. Soryu sank at 19:13 hours, with 718 dead. The tactical implications were immediately apparent to senior Japanese commanders. 3 carriers lost meant over 2/3 of the Kido Butai's striking power gone. Even if Hiryu remained operational, even if her strike group could locate and damage American carriers, the strategic balance had shifted irrevocably. Japan had begun the war with 6 large fleet carriers and had lost 2 at Coral Sea in May. Now 3 more were burning or sinking at Midway. That left one, Hiryu, still operational at Midway, and only one additional fleet carrier, Shokaku, undergoing repairs in Japan. The United States, despite losses at Coral Sea and the damage Yorktown had already sustained before Midway, still had Enterprise, Hornet, Saratoga, undergoing repairs, and additional Essex-class carriers already under construction. American industrial capacity meant damaged carriers could be repaired in weeks, new carriers could be built in months, and losses could be replaced faster than Japan could inflict them. Japanese industrial capacity meant each carrier lost was essentially irreplaceable. But the tactical disaster was only beginning. Hiryu, the fourth carrier, had escaped the morning dive bomber attacks due to her separated position from the main formation. Her air group launched a strike that successfully located and damaged Yorktown, achieving tactical revenge for the morning's catastrophe. But Yorktown's dive bomber squadron, still operating from Enterprise after their own carrier was hit, located Hiryu at approximately 1700 hours and executed another devastating attack. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck in rapid succession. The same cascade of catastrophic failures that had destroyed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu now consumed the final carrier. Aviation fuel ignited, ordnance exploded, and fires spread beyond control. By early morning of June 5th, Hiryu was a burning hulk, abandoned by her surviving crew. Japanese destroyers torpedoed her to prevent capture, but she remained stubbornly afloat. She finally sank at 0900 hours, on June 5th, over 16 hours after being struck, taking 416 crew members to the bottom. The Battle of Midway concluded with all 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk, over 3,000 Japanese naval personnel dead, over 240 aircraft destroyed, and Japan's elite carrier striking force effectively eliminated as a coherent fighting force. American losses included Yorktown, sunk by Japanese submarine I-168 on June 7th, approximately 145 aircraft destroyed, and 307 personnel killed. The exchange ratio was catastrophically one-sided, and its implications resonated far beyond simple ship counts. The mathematics of carrier aviation warfare became brutally clear in the aftermath of June 4th. A fleet carrier wasn't simply a ship that could be replaced through construction. It was a floating airbase that represented years of institutional knowledge, trained personnel, and operational experience. The Akagi alone had been in service since 1927. Her air group had trained together for years, and her crew understood carrier operations at a level that couldn't be replicated through training manuals or simulated exercises. When Akagi sank, Japan didn't just lose 36,000 tons of steel. They lost Commander Minoru Genda's operational expertise, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's air group leadership, and hundreds of veteran pilots, mechanics, ordnancemen, and specialists who understood carrier warfare at an intuitive level. The institutional knowledge, represented by those 4 carriers, the lessons learned from hundreds of operations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, the developed tactics and procedures that had made the Kido Butai the most effective carrier force in the world, all of it went to the bottom with the ships. American intelligence had suspected Japanese carriers were operating near Midway, but the extent of Japanese commitment wasn't clear until after the Saif battle. When Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, received reports that all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been sunk, his initial reaction was skepticism. The intelligence seemed too good, too decisive, almost impossible. Carrier battles to that point had been inconclusive affairs, where both sides sustained damage but withdrew to fight another day. The complete annihilation of an entire carrier striking force in a single day's combat was unprecedented. It would take weeks of intelligence analysis, examination of intercepted Japanese communications, and reports from submarines tracking damaged ships before American commanders fully understood what they had achieved. The United States had won not just a tactical victory, but a strategic reversal that fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory. The 4 minutes that decided the battle, from 09:22 when lookouts first spotted inbound dive bombers to 09:26 when the first bombs struck, represented the culmination of multiple failures in Japanese doctrine, intelligence, and operational decision-making. Each failure individually was survivable. Combined, they created the catastrophic vulnerability that American dive bombers exploited. The first failure was intelligence. Japanese reconnaissance on the morning of June 4th was inadequate for the threat environment. The scout plane from the cruiser Tone launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems, creating a gap in search coverage exactly where American carriers were operating. When Tone No. 4 finally did spot American ships at 07:28 hours, the report was vague. 10 ships, including what appears to be one carrier. This ambiguity prevented Nagumo from understanding the true threat. Were there one or multiple American carriers? What types of ships comprised the formation? What was their course and speed? American intelligence, by contrast, had achieved something approaching complete clarity. Navy codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken Japanese naval code JN-25 and determined not just that an operation was planned, but where it would occur, when it would occur, and which forces would participate. Admiral Nimitz knew days in advance that 4 Japanese fleet carriers would attack Midway on or around June 4th. This allowed him to position Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown at Point Luck, northeast of Midway, perfectly positioned to ambush the Japanese fleet. The intelligence advantage gave American commanders time to plan, brief pilots, position forces, and launch strikes at optimal moments. Japanese commanders operated reactively, responding to American initiatives rather than executing their own operational plan. This reactive posture, forced by inadequate intelligence, meant Japanese carriers spent the morning of June 4th responding to changing situations rather than controlling the battle's tempo. The second failure was in the rearming decision. Vice Admiral Nagumo's order at 07:15 to rearm the reserve strike force from ship attack to land attack configuration wasn't unreasonable given available information. No American carriers had been spotted. The first Midway strike was returning and needed to land immediately, and the island installations remained combat capable. But the decision created vulnerability by concentrating ordnance on deck during the rearming process. When Tone No. 4's report arrived at 07:28, forcing a second rearming order from land attack back to ship attack configuration, the vulnerability multiplied. Japanese carriers spent over 90 minutes with aircraft, fuel lines, and loose ordnance scattered across their flight decks. The crews worked with desperate speed, but speed created additional risk. Safety procedures were abbreviated. Ordnance that should have been struck below to magazines was left stacked on deck. Fuel lines remained connected to aircraft longer than regulations specified. American carrier doctrine handled rearming differently. Aircraft were struck below to hangars for ordnance changes, keeping the flight deck clear for operations. This reduced the speed of rearming operations, but it also reduced vulnerability by keeping fuel and ordnance in protected spaces rather than exposed on deck. The trade-off accepted slower operational tempo in exchange for survivability. Japanese doctrine made the opposite choice, and on June 4th, that choice proved fatal. The third failure was defensive coordination. The combat air patrol that morning performed exactly as trained, intercepting low-altitude torpedo bomber attacks and destroying them with devastating efficiency. But Japanese fighter direction doctrine didn't account for simultaneous multi-altitude threats. The Zeros that massacred American torpedo bombers at sea level couldn't simultaneously defend against dive bombers at 15,000 feet. American attacks, though poorly coordinated by plan, achieved effective coordination by accident. The torpedo bombers, arriving piecemeal between 0800 and 0930 hours, drew Japanese fighters down to sea level. The dive bombers, arriving just as the torpedo attacks were concluding, found the sky above the carriers essentially undefended. It was tactical serendipity, born from navigation errors and communication failures that paradoxically created the perfect attacking sequence. Japanese radar technology in 1942 was less advanced than American or British equivalents. The carriers had basic air search radar, but it was short-range, unreliable, and not integrated into a comprehensive fighter direction system. Defending fighters relied primarily on visual spotting by ship lookouts, which worked adequately against single-altitude threats, but failed completely when facing attacks from multiple altitudes simultaneously. The fourth failure was in carrier design philosophy. American carriers sacrificed some aircraft capacity and operational tempo for survivability features. Armored flight decks on some designs, extensive compartmentalization, redundant fire mains, and protected aviation fuel storage all reduced the likelihood that a single bomb hit would cause catastrophic damage. Japanese carriers prioritized offensive capability, accepting vulnerability as the price of maintaining maximum strike power. This design philosophy assumed Japanese carriers would strike first. Their superior pilots and coordinated tactics would neutralize enemy carriers before those carriers could launch effective counterstrikes. At Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Coral Sea, this assumption held true. At Midway, it failed catastrophically. The moment American dive bombers penetrated to attack position, every offensive advantage Japanese carriers possessed became meaningless, and every defensive deficiency became fatal. The bombs themselves tell part of the story. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, flown by most of the American pilots at Midway, carried a single 1,000-pound bomb or a 500-pound bomb depending on mission requirements. On June 4th, most SBDs carried 1,000-pounders, Mark 13 general-purpose bombs that weren't designed specifically for armor penetration but proved devastatingly effective against unarmored flight decks. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from 15,000 feet reached terminal velocity of approximately 600 feet per second. The kinetic energy from that velocity, combined with the explosive force of the bomb itself, was sufficient to penetrate the teak wood flight deck and the thin steel plating beneath, allowing the bomb to explode inside the hangar spaces where aircraft, fuel, and ordnance were concentrated. The bombs didn't need to be precision weapons. A near miss on the flight deck was still a catastrophic hit given the concentration of vulnerability. Japanese damage control doctrine emphasized containing damage through compartmentalization and fighting fires before they spread to critical spaces. This worked adequately against single hits or limited damage. At Midway, the bombs struck in rapid succession, multiple hits on each carrier within seconds of each other, creating simultaneous fires in multiple locations that overwhelmed available damage control resources. Akagi took 3 bombs in approximately 20 seconds. The first bomb hit amidships, penetrating to the upper hangar before exploding. The blast killed dozens of crew members instantly and ignited 3 Type 99 carrier bombers that were being refueled. The second bomb struck near the aft elevator, its explosion rupturing aviation fuel lines and starting fires that spread rapidly forward through the hangar. The third bomb hit near the island superstructure, its blast effect reaching into command spaces and damaging communications equipment. The damage control parties responded immediately, but they faced an impossible situation. 3 separate major fires, all fed by aviation fuel, all spreading through spaces packed with aircraft and ordnance. Fire mains had been ruptured by blast damage, reducing water pressure. Smoke spread through ventilation systems, making it difficult to reach affected spaces. Worst of all, bombs and torpedoes left on deck from the rearming operations began cooking off from the heat, creating secondary explosions that killed damage control personnel and spread fires to new areas. Captain Taijiro Aoki ordered counterflooding to correct a developing list, but this complicated firefighting efforts by reducing the ship's stability. He ordered magazines flooded to prevent catastrophic explosions, but the flooding caused additional weight low in the ship, increasing stability problems. By 1100 hours, 2 hours after being struck, Akagi was effectively dead as a combat platform. The fires were beyond control, engineering spaces were threatened, and the Emperor's portrait, the sacred object that symbolized the ship's soul, had been evacuated to the cruiser Nagara. Vice Admiral Nagumo's decision to transfer his flag to Nagara at 10:46 hours was both practical and symbolic. Practically, Akagi's communications equipment was damaged, her command spaces were filling with smoke, and continuing to command the battle from a burning ship was impossible. Symbolically, the transfer acknowledged that Akagi was finished, that the Kido Butai as constituted that morning no longer existed, and that the operational plan for Midway had collapsed completely. From Nagara's bridge, Nagumo watched the carriers he had commanded burn. Each represented not just military capability, but personal relationships, institutional memory, and Imperial Japan's projection of power across the Pacific. Akagi had been his flagship. Kaga had supported him at Coral Sea. Soryu and Hiryu were the newer carriers that represented Japan's expanding naval aviation capability. Watching them burn was watching Japan's carrier aviation expertise consumed by fire. The human stories behind the statistics reveal the battle's true cost. Aviation Ordnanceman First Class. Abe Zenji was working on Akagi's flight deck when the bombs struck, struggling to swap an 800-kilogram bomb for a torpedo on a Type 97 carrier attack plane. The first bomb hit 50 feet from his position, the blast throwing him against the island superstructure. He survived with severe burns and shrapnel wounds, but 14 men working alongside him died instantly. He spent the next 3 hours in a makeshift aid station on the Fantail, watching the ship he'd served on for 4 years die. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the first Midway strike and radioed back that a second strike was necessary, returned from that mission to find his carrier, Hiryu, the only one still, operational. His aircraft had been damaged, fuel tanks holed by anti-aircraft fire. He volunteered to lead the afternoon strike against Yorktown, despite knowing his damaged aircraft didn't have fuel for the return trip. He located Yorktown, pressed his attack, scored hits, and was never seen again. His body was never recovered. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, Pearl Harbor strike leader and Akagi's air operations officer, was in the sickbay recovering from appendicitis when the bombs struck. Unable to walk, he was carried to the flight deck by shipmates as fires spread below. He watched from Nagara as Akagi burned, later writing that seeing the carrier destroyed felt like watching a family member die. He survived the war and became a Christian missionary, spending decades trying to reconcile his role in starting a war with his later commitment to peace. The pilots who delivered those devastating attacks weren't elite professionals. They were mostly young men in their early 20s, many flying combat missions for the first time. Lieutenant Richard Best, flying from Enterprise, led a 3-plane section that attacked Akagi. He watched his bomb hit amidships, saw the explosion, and later recalled thinking, "We got one." He didn't know until days later that his single bomb hit, combined with 2 others, had dealt fatal damage to Japan's flagship carrier. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's attack, floated in the ocean for hours after his Devastator was shot down, hiding under a seat cushion to avoid being strafed. He watched from sea level as dive bombers attacked, seeing the bombs hit, the fires start, and the Japanese formation break apart. He was rescued the next day, the only member of his 15-man squadron to survive. He spent the rest of his life struggling with survivor's guilt, wondering why he lived when his friends died. The Japanese pilot perspective reveals different trauma. Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto, flying a Zero on combat, air patrol when the dive bombers struck, described watching helplessly from 10,000 feet below as American bombers dove on Kaga. He tried to climb to intercept altitude, but his Zero, already low on fuel from extended patrol, couldn't reach attacking altitude before the bombs struck. He watched Kaga burn, knowing many of his squadron mates were aboard, knowing there was nothing he could do. Warrant Officer Kyoto Furuta, a Zero pilot aboard Soryu, was airborne on combat air patrol when his carrier was hit. He circled for hours as all 4 carriers burned, radio calls becoming increasingly desperate as pilots asked where they should land. Some ditched when fuel ran out. Others flew to Midway and attempted landings on Japanese-controlled portions of the island. Furuta eventually landed on Hiryu, the only carrier still operational, only to watch her struck by dive bombers that afternoon. He survived by ditching near a destroyer and spent the rest of the war wondering if he'd been cursed to watch every carrier he served on destroyed. The afternoon action, where Hiryu launched 2 strikes against Yorktown before being herself destroyed, demonstrated both Japanese resilience and the impossibility of recovering from the morning's disaster. Hiryu's first strike, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, located Yorktown at approximately noon and scored 3 bomb hits. The damage was severe, forcing Yorktown's crew to abandon ship temporarily, but American damage control proved superior to Japanese expectations. Within hours, Yorktown was back underway, her fires controlled, her systems partially restored. Hiryu's second strike, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters led by Lieutenant Tomonaga, attacked at approximately 1440 hours and scored 2 torpedo hits that finally crippled Yorktown beyond immediate repair. But these tactical successes couldn't change the strategic reality, even if Hiryu had destroyed all 3. American carriers, which was beyond her capability with remaining aircraft. Japan had still lost 3 fleet carriers and couldn't replace them. The dive bomber strike that found Hiryu at 1700 hours executed almost exactly the same attack that had destroyed her sister carriers that morning. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, leading dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown orphaned aircraft, found Hiryu maneuvering to evade, her combat air patrol depleted by the afternoon strikes. 24 SBD Dauntlesses dove from 15,000 feet. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck in rapid succession, creating the now familiar cascade of catastrophic damage. Aviation fuel ignited, ordnance exploded, fires spread beyond control. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from Hiryu, chose to go down with his ship. He could have transferred to a screening vessel, could have survived to command future operations, but he accepted responsibility for the Kolonik disaster and elected to die with his command. Captain Tomio Kaku made the same choice. Both men were last seen on Hiryu's bridge as the ship burned, having ordered their crews to abandon ship but refusing to leave themselves. The decision to scuttle Hiryu came early morning June 5th, after damage control efforts had clearly failed. Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into the burning carrier, attempting to hasten her sinking and prevent potential capture. But Hiryu refused to die quickly. She remained afloat for hours after being torpedoed, her hull glowing red from internal fires, finally sinking at 0900 hours. 34 officers and 382 enlisted men went down with her, many trapped below decks, others choosing to remain aboard rather than face the shame of surviving their ship's destruction. The strategic implications became clear even before the battle ended. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier striking force, received reports of the carrier losses throughout the day. His operational plan had assumed Japanese carriers would neutralize American carriers, allowing his battleships to close and destroy remaining American surface forces in a decisive night action. The carrier losses made this plan impossible. Without air cover, his battleships were vulnerable to American air attack. Without carriers to locate American forces, he was operating blind. Most critically, without the carriers that represented Japan's offensive striking power, the entire strategic concept behind the Midway operation, seizing the island to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and force a decisive battle, TAT, had collapsed. At 02:55 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw. The Midway operation was cancelled. The fleet would retire to Japan. The withdrawal decision acknowledged not just tactical defeat, but strategic failure. Japan had committed her best forces to an operation designed to eliminate American carrier power and establish dominant positioning in the Central Pacific. Instead, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the United States had lost 1, and the strategic balance had shifted decisively in America's favor. The 6-month period of Japanese offensive operations, from Pearl Harbor in December 1941 through the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and the Indian Ocean raids, had ended. The 4 minutes at Midway didn't just sink 4 carriers, they ended Japan's strategic initiative, transformed the Pacific War from Japanese offense and American defense to American offense and Japanese defense, and initiated a 2.5-year campaign that would culminate in Japan's unconditional surrender. Every subsequent American offensive operation, from Guadalcanal in August 1942 through Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, was possible because Japan no longer had the carrier forces to contest American naval supremacy. The Japanese attempt to rebuild carrier aviation after Midway revealed the irreplaceable nature of what was lost. New carriers could be built, were built, but the pilots and crews couldn't be replaced. The average Japanese carrier pilot at Midway had over 800 flight hours. Replacement pilots entering service in 1943 had 300 hours, barely enough to land on a carrier safely. By 1944, replacement pilots had less than 100 hours, and many died in training accidents before ever seeing combat. The institutional knowledge lost with those 4 carriers, the hard-won tactical lessons, the developed procedures, the experience that allowed veteran crews to operate efficiently under combat stress, all of it was irreplaceable. New crews had to relearn lessons that veteran crews knew instinctively. New pilots made mistakes that veterans had learned to avoid. The learning curve was written in blood, ships lost, missions failed, and men killed because the expertise that could have saved them died at Midway. American pilot Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, who bombed Kaga on June 4, returned to the United States in late 1942 and spent months training new dive bomber pilots. He emphasized one lesson above all others. We won at Midway, not because we were better pilots, but because we got lucky at exactly the right moment. The Japanese made mistakes, and we were positioned to exploit those mistakes. Don't ever assume you'll be that lucky again. The Battle of Midway was studied intensely by both sides throughout the war. American analysts identified the critical factors: superior intelligence that allowed optimal positioning, aggressive tactics that forced Japanese carriers into defensive posture, and the serendipitous timing that placed dive bombers over Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Japanese analysts reached different conclusions, emphasizing the need for better reconnaissance, more robust damage control, and defensive doctrine that could handle simultaneous multi-altitude threats. But the fundamental lesson was simpler. In carrier aviation warfare, the side that struck first with the most aircraft usually won. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers struck first and achieved decisive victory. At Midway, American carriers struck first and achieved decisive victory. The 4 minutes that decided the battle were simply the execution phase of a longer campaign that included intelligence gathering, force positioning, and operational decision-making. The human cost of those 4 minutes extended far beyond the men who died on June 4th. Families in Japan received terse notifications that their sons, brothers, and fathers had died in action, with no details about how or where. The Imperial Japanese Navy, obsessed with maintaining morale and operational security, revealed almost nothing about the Midway disaster to the Japanese public. Families spent years not knowing that their loved ones had died in Japan's most catastrophic naval defeat. American families faced similar uncertainty. The families of Torpedo Squadron 8 pilots didn't learn the full story of their deaths until years after the war. They knew their loved ones had been killed at Midway. But the details, the desperate attacks without fighter escort, the one-sided massacre, the courage of men who pressed attacks they knew were suicidal, remained classified until post-war investigations revealed the full story. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.